I'm going to obviously talk about qualitative longitudinal research. I'm going to start off with some theoretical drivers and look at the processual turn. And I'm going to say a little bit about 4 key features of this methodology as I see it, because I think they're quite unique, the combination of those 4. I'll come on and very briefly say a few words about the challenges, but also how to overcome them. And then I'm going to recap at the end with what I see as the strengths of this methodology and its unique potential. So here we go. And that's the book that Hannah was just holding up for you. This is quite a detailed, comprehensive text that runs across different disciplines, actually. So if you wanted to follow up, that would be a good starting point, possibly. So let's look at some of those theoretical backgrounds. We live in a fluid world, and we know this fluid world. It's existed since the beginning of time. If we go back to the days of Heraclitus, he observed that an individual can't step in the same river twice, for both the individual and the river are continually changing. So the river isn't an object, it's an ever-changing flow. The sun is not a thing, it's a flaming fire. So the world is shaped through action, interaction, continuity, change, evolution, revolution. E.P. Thompson, one of our famous social historians, is here talking about class, but you could substitute any social phenomenon here. He says class is not a thing, it's a happening, not this or that part of the machine, but the way the machine works once it's set in motion, the friction of interest, the thundering noise. The definition can only be made in the medium of time. Now, throughout the 20th century, there's been a growing interest in time theory, accompanied by a broad processual turn among researchers, and that straddles the academy. You can see it in all kinds of disciplines, in the natural and social sciences and in arts and humanities. So I'm going to say a little bit now about the processual turn. And I want to start with Henri Bergson, who was a very famous time theorist, Nobel Prize winner. And he was writing in the late 1890s, and subsequently he's influenced numerous writers, time theorists, philosophers and scientists. I've listed a few here, including people working in the sciences. Prigogine, a Nobel Prize winner working in thermodynamics, he said he picked up Bergson's book and the scales fell away from his eyes as he suddenly saw a different way to understand the science that he was looking at. Anyway, Bergson said, there do not exist things that are made, but only in the making, not states that remain fixed, but only states in process of change. Rest is apparent, or rather relative. We arrive at fluid concepts, capable of following reality in all its windings. Now, around 100 years later, those same reflections are echoed in the work of John Law in his lovely book, After Method. He said, events and processes are complex because they necessarily exceed our capacity to know them. We need to create metaphors and images for what is slippery, indistinct, elusive, complex, diffuse, messy, intuitive. The world is not a structure, something we can map with our social science charts. We might think of it instead as a maelstrom or a tide rip, filled with currents, eddies, flows, vortices, unpredictable changes, storms, and with moments of lull and calm. And then he goes on, we begin to imagine what research methods might be if they were adapted to a world that included and knew itself as tide, flux, and general unpredictability. I think back in 2004, there was relatively little written about this methodology, although it was greatly in use, but Law didn't know much about qualitative longitudinal research because that's precisely what this method is designed to do. So a basic insight here, if the social world is fluid in perpetual flux, we need fluid modes of inquiry to investigate and understand it. Now, Qualitative longitudinal research is very well established throughout the academy, and it typically involves small scale, in-depth dynamic studies of the unfolding lives of individuals or collectives. And we can see those against a backdrop of wider historical events and processes, whether they're environmental, institutional, technological, or policy related. And understanding the relationship between these two facets of the social fabric, the individual and the social, the wider institutional, that is important because that relationship between the two is essentially dynamic. C. Wright Mills said, "We can't hope to understand society unless we have a prior understanding of the relationships between biography and history and the problems of social structure in which biography and history intersect." Charles Tilly, an American, a great process researcher, says, "Sociology without history resembles a Hollywood set, great scenes, sometimes brilliantly painted, with nothing and nobody behind them." And here's something that I initially wrote, I think, in around 2003, but this is taken from a 2015 publication. "It is through time that we can begin to grasp the nature of social change and continuity and the mechanisms through which these processes unfold. Indeed, it's only through time that we can gain an understanding of how agency and structure, biography and history, the micro and macro dimensions of society are interconnected and how they come to be transformed. Because that relationship is essentially dynamic. It's only when we bring time into the picture that we can make sense of the changes that are going on." So I want to come on now, having done a whistle-stop tour through some of the conceptual drivers for this mode of research, to look at 4 key features of it. And the first is that this is research that's conducted wherever possible in real time. It's an integral part of the longitudinal canon, and it seeks to follow the same individuals or groups prospectively through time to capture change in the making. That's the phrase that C. Wright Mills uses. So what we're doing is turning a snapshot of the social world into a movie. Now, the designs are flexible, but we need at least 2 waves of fieldwork to generate rich situated data with longitudinal reach. Now, the studies may be conducted intensively over the short term with frequent field visits, and then we may extend the research, and sometimes those studies will continue over decades. But most studies begin relatively intensively, and I've described that as walking alongside people. And in that process, you're looking both forward and backward in time to understand the nature of the process that people are going through. And so what you're doing is turning a snapshot, a series of snapshots of change, into a continuous picture of processes and how they unfold. And QL researchers have been likened to time travelers because they're doing this work of combining prospective and retrospective lenses. A second key feature of this research then, this is not just happening in real time, but this is up close qualitative research. It's located within the interpretivist tradition with strong affinities to longitudinal ethnography, biographical, life history, and narrative research. What we're doing is seeking to mirror real-world processes through an in-depth qualitative lens. We can gain insights into how people narrate, understand, practice, and shape their evolving lives and the evolving world of which they are a part. So with this approach, we take human agency and subjectivity seriously. Human agency, that capacity to act, to interact, to influence the shape of our own lives and indeed the lives of others. Subjectivity, the meaning that events and processes hold for those who experience them. And that is just as important for our understanding of the social world as any objectively defined fact. So what we're doing then is creating a particular kind of movie, going back to the movie metaphor. This is the up close and personal movie, which has enhanced depth and explanatory power. And it very nicely complements the large scale movie that the large scale data sets can generate. So we're in the realm of using ethnography, life journey and biographical interviewing, and participatory methods. And these are commonly combined to gain insights into the inner logic of people's lives, how change is actually created, negotiated, lived, and experienced. So a third key feature of this methodology now, it is fluid inquiry. We're dealing with a kaleidoscope of temporal flows. You can see the kaleidoscope there. It is a complex picture, which is why we need the complexities to be unpicked through qualitative inquiry. So, and I've tried to set out some of the complex fluid ontology that takes us beyond a linear understanding of time as kind of what happens next. Now, that is a very useful starting point, that chronology. But we know that lives don't necessarily unfold in chronological order through discrete stages in one linear direction or at a uniform pace. Processes may be unpredictable. Lives are shaped by multiple contingent events, actions, interactions, flowing at different speeds in all directions through different horizons of time, past to future, short term to longer term, and at different scales of the social fabric. So we need a much more complex and nuanced understanding of the flux of change. Just to give you, to focus on one dimension of this, past, present, and future intersect in very complex ways. We're forever coming to a new vantage point in time from which to overwrite our biographies, to look back and reinterpret the past, to look forward to re-envisage the future. And when we do this research, we are in that recursive loop. This is recursion, where time seems to loop back on itself. So things that are never fixed, and a picture that we may glean at one point in time may change by the time we go back out into the field. We're gaining insights then, not just into changing practices or events, but into changing perceptions. And we're recognizing that our identities are in flux. I think for this centre, dealing with issues of mental health and so on, these are important things to try to grasp, of course. Just a slide from Molly Andrews in her lovely book, Doing Narrative Research. She's here we have one of her participants talking, who has had a life as a political activist, and she's looking back over her life and talking about the journey that she's been on as a political activist. And she says, when you look back, you see the path or paths that you've taken. The path would obviously not be so clear when you're groping up and finding it, would it? I mean, it's rather like going up a mountain and you're sort of looking that way and that track, and it looks too steep and you're going round. Whereas when you're high up, you can look back and see, and it sort of stands out much more clearly, things that you didn't realize at the time. This is where we reinterpret our past. And we know this from Kierkegaard, who said, life must be lived forwards, but it must be understood backwards. I wanted to give you an example of the kind of tools that we might use to gain this, a fluid picture of unfolding lives. These are life maps, very commonly used. And this is taken from the work of Gwinnett and Marshall, and it's a study of women's employment journeys and how they may have been affected by times of abuse. And you can see Melanie's life map here. You can see, for example, towards the top of the map, little whirls of colour in blue and green where she goes off her main path. You can see a time of abuse, which is marked with a black jagged line, and a very difficult time before that marked in red, and then a big dip down. And then in more recent years, a nice flowing rainbow as she comes up and she begins to flourish. This is a kind of tool which shows us how the paths that we follow are completely non-linear. And these are very good tools to think with, because they enable people to articulate things that sometimes are very difficult to articulate. And again, with mental health, that would be a pertinent thing to bear in mind. I want to say a word about causal complexity now. Causal processes are not just a matter of A leads to B, they're necessarily complex. We have to try to understand their multiple nature, their fluid and relational elements. Much more about that in an article that I also wrote in 2021. So we might, for example, explore the pace or speed or tempo of change, the elasticity of time. All of these factors influence the nature of a journey. We might want to look at short-term or longer-term time horizons, how time telescopes. How and why do things stand still or stagnate or slow down or speed up or rewind? How does change emerge, evolve, grow, stabilize and recede? Is it a sudden process, a revolutionary process? The arrival of a pandemic may feel like that. Or is it slow burn and hidden? Climate change, for example, an evolutionary process. And what leads to a tipping point, a point of no return in the social or environmental fabric, or indeed in the course of our individual lives? All of this means that we need to focus on the nature of the journey, not just the destination. It's that old idea from Homer that the nature of the journey is just as important as the destination. So we've got a process, not just the outcome, and the how of change, not just what changes. If we don't understand the how of change, we won't understand why things change. I want to say a word about policy implications at this point, because this kind of method has particular value where people are encouraged or required or are seeking to change their lives or adapt to changing circumstances. If we can understand people's fluid transitions into and out of poverty or prison, employment or education, health or housing, migration or mobility, or their journeys through aging, pandemics, recessions, various kinds of external upheavals, then we can create useful know-how knowledge that will help policy to better manage these processes and support people through them. So I'm suggesting here that with this method, we can address some of the grand challenges of social science in a world of rapid social change. And we can also use this method as a navigational tool to run alongside a policy process or an intervention. And we can investigate the effectiveness of interventions and the impact, their impact, and also the impact of historical processes. I can come back to that theme if you'd like me to in the chat afterwards. Okay, I want to come now to a fourth key feature of this methodology, which is the methodology itself is fluid. The way a study is designed and conducted, from sampling to analysis, is fluid. It responds flexibly to the processes under study. So the research itself becomes part of the moving picture. It's responsive, interactive, adaptable, and it has to be because it needs to be attuned to the flux of the world. Each wave of fieldwork and analysis informs the next in a nice cumulative process of knowledge building, that idea of following reality in all its windings. And all of this means that we have to have some flexibility in research design so that we can follow lives where they lead. And an example here from the work of Lynn Cowman, a health researcher. She was following a sample of terminally ill cancer patients to explore the progression of the disease. But that particular study had a rigid design with clear times when the researchers would be out in the field. And that meant that many of the patients died before the researchers could visit them again. And the researchers reflected, therefore, that a much more flexible schedule of field work would have enabled them to follow the full sample and respond to and mirror how the disease was progressing in each case. That's an example of the kind of fluidity that you might want to build into a study. And I've got here an example of a QL process evaluation. It's one I really like. It's taken from health research. I think I'm going to run out of time if I go through it, but maybe we can come back to that in the chat if you'd like me to. What I want to do now is move on to a few challenges. Just briefly, because there are many. One is sometimes people say this is a very expensive way of doing research, much more expensive than single visits to the field. And that is the case, although we have to bear in mind that it's also very cost effective within the longitudinal canon compared with those large data sets that gobble up millions and millions of pounds. There's an issue of sample maintenance. Now, this requires ongoing effort over time to keep your participants in a study. I think of it more as a matter of sustaining relationships over many years. And if you're able to do that, that's the best way of maintaining your sample. And that in itself brings us to mind the whole issue of longitudinal ethics. And there are some unique challenges when we do this kind of research. For example, we need a commitment to reciprocity when we work over time with people. But at the same time, we've got to maintain our professional boundaries. How do we get a nice balance there? We have also, for example, to bring ethical closure to a study. People become very committed to the research. They enjoy being part of a study like this. So we have to be very ethical in the way that we bring a study to a close. There's a third issue here, data deluge. This method yields oceans of data, as Johnny Saldana says, that may lead to death by data asphyxiation. That's Andrew Pettigrew. All of the studies mention this kind of problem. You may have a small sample, maybe 15, 20, 25 people, relatively small. But if you're going out into the field again and again, then you're generating very large data sets. All of that requires good data management and careful design so that researchers and participants are not overloaded with relentless waves of fieldwork. And you have to build in time for rest and reflection and analysis between your waves of fieldwork. This kind of way of working is analytically quite complex. You're switching the temporal gaze between different horizons of time, and you're also working in 3 dimensions. You've got your cases and your themes, but you've also got processes to think about, and you're bringing case, theme, and process into alignment. It's intellectually demanding and time-consuming. There were 3 chapters on analysis in the book that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, accounts of process tracing and mapping currently are sparse. So there's great potential there to go there and write about how this should be done better. There's a final problem, I think, which is that policymakers will say that this kind of research, longitudinal research generally, just takes too long to be of use. But my riposte to that would be that we can create impact as we go along as part of the research process. The fact that we're doing research through time doesn't mean it has to take a long time. We could be doing a study over a year, an intensive study, and we can gain a great deal of insight over a relatively short period of time. But also, as I've said, if you run a study alongside an intervention, then you can create impact by doing that. And there's an example that I can refer to if you want me to come back to that in the Q&A. I think one of the things to say here is that 20 years ago, there wasn't an extensive body of literature to guide us through these processes, but that's the work that methodologists have been doing over the past 20 years. And so there's a lot written about how to avoid the kind of pitfalls that I've been talking about here. I want to just come on to the issue of flexibility or continuity. As I've been saying, flexibility is regarded as a great strength of this methodology, but a QL study can unravel if it lacks continuity and precision. That this is an issue of design. There's a lovely quotation here from Johnny Saldana showing how we might have all sorts of detours and revised plans, and we can go off into all sorts of directions. And he says that is the researcher's journey through a QL study. But we have to try to avoid a study unraveling. So we have to have various balancing acts to ensure that we can balance flexibility with continuity, creativity with precision. We can, for example, create a nice temporal logic to a study through specifying clear baseline and closure points. The closure point might be a purely pragmatic, I've got to the end of my funding, I've got 3 years and I've got to wrap it up. But either way, you've got to anchor your study somewhere, somehow in time, so that you can contain it. When you're generating data, just for example, you need both continuity and flexibility. You need questions about key themes and processes that are built in at each wave. And these provide nice through lines in the data to ensure that your growing data set has some integrity and internal coherence, and allows for both comparisons and connections across the waves of data. So those are your continuity questions. But you also need flexible questions that you generate afresh at each wave. And that allows the researcher to formulate new lines of inquiry that are in tune with evolving lives and that can follow lives where they lead. Just to give you one example there, with the Following Young Fathers study, which I was doing for over about 10 years and was published just recently, we had nothing in our study about the role of grandparents. We went out into the field and realized just how important that whole theme was. So we then built in a whole suite of questions about the role of grandparents. So we changed our research questions as we went along. The fact that this method is exploratory, creative, flexible, adaptable is, I think, a key strength, as long as we do it carefully. In fact, it derives its rigor from its capacity to mirror the flux of the world, to reflect real world processes in real time and up close. And I just wanted to bring in here a little quotation from Frank Herbert's Dune, which I read in the late 1960s. You might know it from the recent films, but it's suffused with lovely quotations about time. He says, "Understanding moves with the flow of the process. It must flow with it." I wanted to give you an example of how you might build some precision in and contain your study. And one way to do that is through using conceptual roadmaps. I've always used them, and all my doctoral students have used them. This is a roadmap taken from a study which is about housing young parents. But you can hopefully get a general idea of what this is about. You have a nice chart. Your column in the left-hand side lists your research questions, and then you have your sub-questions, and then your sources of data, samples and field materials. And then you go on to your fieldwork themes. And from that, you can go on to actually devise the kind of questions, the actual questions that you want to ask. But it's when you're in the midst of your fieldwork, you've got a map that takes you back to your research questions, which in themselves may change as your study develops. A key question: can we find closure? Is QLR too fluid, too open-ended? Pettigrew says, when does a change process begin and end, especially where the unit of analysis is the continuous process in context? When does the fieldworker stop and start collecting data? Does one stop peeling the layers from the onion only when the vapours inhibit all further sight? There are, of course, no simple and absolute answers to such questions. My colleagues Rachel Thompson and Janet Holland said many years ago, observations are never safe because they may always be overturned in subsequent waves. And so I suppose my key question is that a problem? Let's just have a think about that. How might we reformulate the notion of closure? Well, we know that in this fluid, complex world, things are always contingent. They're half finished, they're unpredictable. We're always in the middle of things with no clear ending in sight. And there are always layers of truth and more than one story to tell. We may feel we've got a really good picture at one point in time, and then a completely different picture at the next point in time. It may be difficult to discern why things change or grasp all the factors that shape lives in some nice, neat, orderly progression. Because there are no definitive or universal answers, we have to aim for plausible explanations. And we have to recognize that our findings are valid in the moment of production, but necessarily provisional, partial, subject to revision. And I suppose the key point I want to make here is that this should never be seen as a weakness, because it's the hallmark of the fluid world that we inhabit. all leading researchers who work in this field make similar points, because they all stress the need for responsible scholarship and for modesty in our interpretations. You can see that in the work of the late, great Paul Cilliers, a complexity researcher, and in the work of Jane Elliott, a leading longitudinal researcher in the UK. I think it's really interesting now, this idea that we are all working with interpretations that may shift and change. Physicists are having to work with that notion. That natural sciences are having to recognize that there are no universal or definitive answers. And I think this is an important implication, because in this fluid, complex world, an interpretive framework or orientation isn't an optional extra anymore. We should never see it as merely supplementary, because it's an essential foundation for responsible scholarship. I'm just coming on to the ending now. This is my last slide. QL research is a journey that requires stamina, organisation, sustained commitment, funding, often over years. It's a very powerful tool for investigating the how and the why of change, the inner logic of lives, discovering the unimaginable. And when we work with fluid time and causal complexity, we have to engage our imaginations, our intuition, and our creative thinking. It is an interpretive endeavour. And I tend to use abductive logic, which fits this framework so beautifully and takes us beyond some debate about whether we're doing inductive or deductive. We can do both if we adopt abductive logic. This kind of research involves a leap into the unknown, a capacity to see beyond the visible. We may not know where our research will lead, for how long or in what direction, but we will find undoubtedly some compelling insights along the way. So just a health warning then to finish off. This is taken from the lovely work of Barbara Adam, a time theorist. She says, seeing things up close through the lens of time changes simply everything. And you will never want to go back to your snapshot views of the world again. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.